In the year 1100, London was a muddy cluster of wooden buildings huddled inside old Roman walls. Paris was a fortified island on the Seine. But 800 years before the Mayflower landed, there was a city on the Mississippi River holding more people than both European capitals combined. It was called Cahokia. At its peak, this city housed roughly 20,000 residents across 6 square miles. The houses were arranged in precise, neat rows around open plazas, supported by satellite villages and farmland supplying the urban core. American cities like New York and Philadelphia would not surpass this level of population density until the late 1700s. At the center of it all stood a structure now called Monk's Mound. It rose about 100 feet, built from an estimated 22 million cubic feet of hand-packed earth. There was no draft animal in North America capable of hauling that load, and no wheel in common use for construction. Every single basket of dirt required to build that pyramid was carried by human hands. Cahokia anchored a trade network that stretched thousands of miles. Archaeologists digging inside the city have uncovered copper from the Great Lakes and shells from the Gulf of Mexico, shaped into intricate artifacts by Mississippian artists. Luxury goods and raw materials moved across a massive portion of the continent. This hyper-dense urban center contradicts the traditional narrative of pre-colonial North America, the story of a continent of untouched, empty wilderness waiting for Europeans to bring civilization. Cahokia was part of a continent teeming with diverse, highly organized societies. It served as the largest expression of the Mississippian culture, a network of related nations spreading advanced agricultural systems across the central and southeastern regions. In the desert Southwest, Pueblo peoples constructed multi-story stone and adobe apartment complexes. These were coordinated, master-planned communities housing hundreds of people, built centuries before European contact. Some of them are still standing today. 800 miles northeast of Cahokia, the Haudenosaunee, known in English as the Iroquois Confederacy, designed a sophisticated political structure. Long before the U.S. Constitution, they built a system binding separate nations under a shared council, complete with mechanisms for debate, consensus building, and strict checks on individual power. When Europeans eventually encountered the vast earthen mounds at Cahokia, many refused to believe native peoples had built them. The architecture and political structures they found were so sophisticated that the colonizers openly struggled to accept their origins. That disbelief served as the psychological foundation of a deliberate, decades-long campaign to erase the history of complex native nations, providing the justification required for the impending conquest. When European ships arrived, they brought pathogens the continent had never experienced: smallpox, measles, influenza. Diseases that had spent thousands of years evolving alongside Old World populations were introduced to immune systems with zero prior exposure. The disease moved faster than the settlers themselves. In places like the Jemez province of New Mexico, the major biological shock hit nearly a century after first contact. Epidemics outpaced the colonizers, devastating communities that had never even met a European. This chart visualizes the scale of the demographic collapse. Between 1500 and 1820, Native American populations living east of the Mississippi River fell to roughly 6% of their pre-contact numbers. Across the hemisphere, some closely studied regions suffered population drops as high as 87% within a relatively short window. That scale of loss tore apart the physical and political defenses of the continent. The civilizations that survived the first wave of contact were immediately forced into a vulnerable position, clearing the path for the massive legal and territorial theft that followed. Behind the epidemics came a slow-motion political machine designed to separate native nations from land they had occupied for thousands of years. The defining moment of that process was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. The United States government forced the Cherokee Nation, along with the Choctaw, Creek, Chickasaw, and Seminole, off their ancestral lands in the southeast. They were marched roughly 1,000 miles west to present-day Oklahoma. Families were given days, sometimes hours, to abandon their homes. The march took place in brutal winter conditions, leaving thousands dead along the route from exposure, starvation, and disease. This established the blueprint for the rest of the century. The government would sign a treaty guaranteeing land forever, violate that treaty,
fight a war, and then negotiate a new treaty. Within a single generation, boundaries would be redrawn again and again, causing originally promised territories to shrink to a fraction of their size. Nations were confined to these shrinking reservations, often on land deliberately selected because it was the least agriculturally useful. The food rations, resources, and infrastructure promised by the government frequently arrived late or failed to materialize entirely, resulting in documented mass famines across reservations in the late 1800s. Federal policy engineered these outcomes, mass displacement and starvation, executing them with full knowledge of the human cost involved to eradicate native land rights. By the late 1800s, the military contest for the continent had largely concluded. The United States now turned its attention to the total annihilation of native identity. Beginning in the 1870s, the federal government and church organizations established a vast network of boarding schools. The founding philosophy, openly articulated by the architects of the system, was to kill the Indian in the child in order to save the man. Children were often taken from their families by force. Upon arrival, the schools mandated cutting their hair, replacing their traditional names with English ones, and issuing severe physical punishments if a child was caught speaking their native language. Alongside the schools came a wave of legal suppression aimed squarely at ceremony. In the 1880s, the federal government outlawed the sun dance, one of the most important spiritual gatherings for Plains nations, like the Lakota and Cheyenne. Practicing it could lead to arrest. By the 1890s, the centuries-long population collapse reached its lowest point. Anthropologists estimated that only around 250,000 Native people remained in the present-day United States. Government officials began writing with clinical certainty that Native cultures would simply not survive into the 20th century. Looking at the numbers and the legal machinery they had put in place, the American government believed it had successfully engineered the final, total erasure of an entire civilization. They were wrong. The survival of Native communities happened through quiet, invisible resistance. Languages that had been beaten out of children in classrooms were kept alive at kitchen tables, spoken in hushed tones, and passed from grandparents to grandchildren, taught never to repeat them outside the home. Entire spiritual traditions were forced underground. The ceremonies and oral histories were practiced in secret, carefully guarded away from the eyes of federal agents for over half a century. Across the 20th century, federal policy shifted, slowly and unevenly. The assimilative boarding schools were eventually closed. The bans on religious practices like the sun dance were finally lifted in the 1930s. This displays the demographic recovery. The population that bottomed out at roughly 250,000 people in the 1890s did not stay there. Against every projection made by those who tried to erase them, the population slowly but undeniably grew back, decade after decade. The cultures that officials had confidently declared doomed were still there, damaged, yes, but alive. That cultural and demographic recovery stands as an active, multi-generational triumph. In 1100 AD, there was a city on the Mississippi River bigger than London. The massive earthworks of Cahokia still stand today, physically connecting the ancient metropolis to the generations who outlasted the 1890s nadir. The history of Native America is a record of vast trade networks, complex confederacies, and deep political sophistication. It is the story of a civilization that withstood a 500-year deliberate campaign of erasure. This history remains an ongoing, living narrative, a story of endurance written by a civilization that outlasted every effort to erase it.